Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am so glad that you are taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for another Tuesday afternoon, or whatever time it is where you are, program. We are delighted to be able to have these programs, and we are so happy that you are joining us and interacting. Today's speakers are very own John Beatty. He has been here since 1984, so I feel like it is appropriate to say that his institutional knowledge of the Genealogy Center is fantastic, and his knowledge of so many of his special subjects is unparalleled within this department. So I am so happy he's going to be talking about Indiana church records. We will all be learning something. He has great knowledge to share. So John, you want to get started?
Thank you, Allison. Let me get my screen up here. Welcome to everyone this afternoon. I called this talk Indiana Church Records, although I'm using a lot of Indiana examples in this, but what I'm going to talk about really applies to many other states because the records were very similar throughout the United States for some of these churches. So what you'll see while I'm giving you an Indiana example, you can certainly apply elsewhere. So the first question I have to ask you is, did your ancestors go to a church or synagogue? And if so, what records might exist that will help you in your research? The records of religious congregations are one of the most valuable historical documents available to the genealogist. They come in many different forms and can yield a variety of information about your ancestors. They can also be one of the most difficult and challenging types of records to find. But because they can help us write more exciting, more interesting family histories by providing a more complete picture of our ancestors' lives, they are worth the effort, I think, it often takes to find them. So I want to do three things in this talk. First, I want to speak a little bit about what congregational records are and why they're important. Second, I want to share some strategies you can use for finding them. And third, I want to take you on a visual tour through the records of various denominations to give you some idea of what types of documents you are likely to find once you locate your ancestral congregation. And there are hundreds of denominations in our state alone, and we can only focus on a few. Records of religious congregations fall into several basic types: baptismal or christening records, marriage records, death and burial records, confirmation records, membership rolls, minutes of meetings of the governing board, and then a variety of other types of documents, ephemera, pamphlets, things that can be found in newspapers, local histories, and other records that are all sort of fall into the category or the umbrella of church record. So why look for them? Well, we know that censuses, vital records, county histories, and online websites don't tell us everything we want to know about our ancestors. As genealogists, we always strive to find more information. We want to know our ancestors as people. And when we write our family histories, our goal is to collect and interpret information from as many sources as possible in order to reconstruct their lives in a thorough manner. So here are some of other reasons. One, congregations that maintain records of baptisms, marriages, and burials offer an alternative source for vital records outside of public records. In many instances, such as here in Indiana, they predate the keeping of public vital records. So thus they're an important primary or original record source for finding vital record information. Religious records will sometimes provide additional information beyond public records. Some church records and temple records that had large numbers of immigrants had pastors that were good record keepers and recorded information about precisely where a family originated in Europe. If you're trying to get back across the Atlantic, church records are one possible place you can look for that information. You may be disappointed. Not every church kept such information, and not every record keeper was that good at keeping records, but some did, and it is always worth checking the original congregation to see what might exist. Three, these records can provide a variety of other clues about your ancestors, such as, was one of them a church leader? Was he or she disciplined for a particular infraction? Did they hold church office? If there are records of contributions, you might find clues about your ancestors' economic status. among the records, so that they can be useful for that purpose. And four, and finally, in a broad sense, such records will help us establish the religious or world view of our ancestors. By knowing the history, style, and politics of a congregation, you can tell something about the membership. For example, if your ancestors were Quakers, they would have objected to swearing oaths and would probably have objected to paying tithes and doing military service. If your ancestors were Reformed Presbyterians before the Civil War, they may have been abolitionists who objected to slavery. Some churches are associated with the Underground Railroad, for example. The challenge then as genealogists is to glean as many clues as you can from the records you find as a way of placing your ancestors in the context of the times in which they lived. I want to turn next to the first challenge of church or congregational record research, and that is determining what church or synagogue or Quaker meeting your ancestor may have attended, and after doing so, determining where those records are located. But there are a couple of fallacies that we need to figure out first. For many of us, this can be the most difficult step. And these are some of the fallacies that we have to think about. First, do not assume that the denomination you attend today was the same one to which your ancestors belonged. Religion has a way of weaving itself through the family tree. Membership was especially fluid for many different evangelical Protestant denominations. A former Baptist may have felt equally comfortable in a Methodist church. My own German Lutheran ancestors often switched churches and synods, moving from the Missouri Synod to the Ohio Synod and spreading the baptisms of their children across different congregations and different types of record books. There may have been a number of factors influencing church membership. A man or a woman may switch to the church of their new spouse. This is especially true of men. Neighbors and friends may also influence church membership, as did politics, the appeal of a pastor, or the convenience of location. There may be disputes that happened in a church, that either personal or theological, that led people to leave one congregation and move to another. The second assumption to overcome is the belief that in the so-called good old days, everyone attended church. That's simply not so. Just as today, there were atheists and agnostics and people who felt indifferent toward organized religion. In some places, such as Puritan Massachusetts, church attendance was mandatory, but in later times, periods, and in other localities, it wasn't. Accounts of missionaries are replete with descriptions about how low the state of religious feeling was, especially in certain frontier communities. Sabbath breaking was commonplace. In Indiana, here, as late as 1906, only 34% of the population belonged to a church, with Methodists and Catholics being the two largest denominations. Sometimes men did not wish to commit to the abstention of alcohol that was sometimes required for membership in some churches. Others were intimidated by the strict requirements for membership, such as giving testimonials of religious conversion before a panel of elders, or memorizing a catechism, which is a series of questions and answers that they had to memorize. Even if your ancestors weren't churchgoers, you still need to investigate that possibility, especially if they were immigrants. Churches and synagogues helped their members find work and helped them assimilate into their American culture. So they played a very important social function for immigrants to become acculturated in a particular community. The third fallacy is that all church records, if they are extant, are readily accessible. While more and more records are indeed becoming available in recent years, we will show that that is not always the case. Church records can be kept on the local, state, and national level in various repositories. They can be difficult to find, especially if a congregation is defunct or it merged with a different congregation. Some have also disappeared and their records are now lost. There are a number of strategies for finding what congregation your ancestor attended. It gets a lot more difficult when you're doing urban research than if your ancestors were in a rural community where there are only a couple churches available. So the first step really is to survey all the relevant documents you have at home or through your extended family. A variety of records that your relatives own may contain some important clues. They can include family Bibles, some of which had denominational publishers. There may be a page that shows, like this one, that shows the name of a particular clergyman. confirmation and marriage certificates, obituary clippings, scrapbooks, diaries, and funeral cards can all be helpful. So they say the family Bible may show the minister. There may be like a confirmation certificate that your family has showing when someone was confirmed. This one is a German Lutheran church, the St. Peter's Church here in St. Joseph Township, Allen County, Indiana, where this person was confirmed in 1866. It goes, her birth date is 53 and her confirmation date is 1866. And it gives the name of the pastor that signed the certificate. So lots of clues there that you can go to then to find a record. Maybe her baptism occurred there too. Maybe her marriage occurred there. We don't know, but at least we know that the confirmation occurred there, and that gives us a starting place. Expand your search to the internet. Of course, do a Google search for the name of the congregation and the place that you're researching. US GenWeb site for the county where your family lived can be helpful. Family Search is a great tool. Lots of records are being digitized and put up on Family Search more and more all the time. Ancestry is putting more and more church records online as well as archives.com. So these are all different places you can look for records. This is the Allen County GenWeb page just to show you that they have, this is probably an older slide. It's probably changed now, but there's a churches section that you'll see up there where they've listed all the different churches going through each of the townships and when they were founded. And so that can be helpful. There may be something like that for the area that you're researching. So you want to look at research in a genealogical library or historical society and look for other types of records, published or microfilm church records that might be available there. There may be denominational cemetery records there. There may be other types of records that are held locally in a church that you may have to contact, but see if the church still exists. And even if it doesn't exist, the records might be housed in a church of the same denomination, or they might know where the records are. So some of the sources you can use for finding a record would be county histories, which may have information about local churches in a particular place. Newspaper obituaries, which will often say where a funeral is being held. Published cemetery records. Here in Fort Wayne, we have a Lutheran cemetery called Concordia Lutheran, and we have a Catholic cemetery. And so there are certain cemeteries that were affiliated with churches. You may find some churches were built with the burial ground right next to the church. That's a very European way of burying people. There may be directories that will show information about what religion the people were or what churches were nearby. A marriage license signed by a clergyman will give you a clue about where the marriage took place. And then there might be published church inventories, histories, archival guides, and Percy also can be helpful. So here's an example. Here's a county history. County histories and atlases are useful for identifying what congregations may have existed in a particular place and time period. If you're dealing with a rural area, even if your ancestor has no biographical sketch, look closely at what churches were extant at the time your ancestors lived there. What church was located nearest to your family's farm, if they had a farm. Directories are also essential tools for doing urban and rural research, and don't forget about newspapers. So here's an obituary example. You can see here that this particular person was buried from Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church with the Reverend M.O. Herman. So you can get an idea that this is where there'll be a burial record, theoretically, for where this person might be, where you'll find a burial record. As I say, denominational cemetery records are available for some denominations. Most mainstream Protestant denominations did not have denominational cemeteries. They were usually buried interchangeably in some kind of municipal cemetery. But Missouri Synod Lutherans were particular about having their own burial grounds, as were Catholics. And so you may find separate burial grounds for them, and that can give you a clue about denominations there. Here's an example of a city directory. So let's say you're doing a research on a person who lived in a town or a city. If there's a directory, you certainly want to look at what churches were extant in the city at the time. This is a Fort Wayne City directory. So you see where the Baptist Church was, where the German Reformed Church, where the German Methodists were, the Lutherans, where the Jewish temple was, where the Methodist Church, Presbyterian, the Episcopal, and the Roman Catholic churches were. And you can look at where your ancestor lived and get some idea of which church was near to where they lived. So if they were German Lutherans, for example, they might it might be important to know whether they went to St. John's or St. Paul's or the Trinity English Lutheran Church, because of where they lived in the city. That could influence a choice. Same with the Catholics. The Catholics often had churches that were garnered for particular ethnic groups. There may be like an Irish Catholic church, a German Catholic church, and a French Catholic church, for example, and an Italian Catholic church. And so people of a certain denomination and ethnicity may go to a particular church that way. This is a directory, an example of a rural directory where they listed the actual denomination of the particular people, which is kind of interesting. And here's an example of a marriage record. Always go back to the original marriage record of someone. Find the original marriage license in the marriage book and find out who performed the marriage. If it was a justice of the peace, well, then it tells you that there's no church record for it. But if it was a minister that performed the marriage, in this case, this was a Presbyterian minister, James Chute, who was here in Fort Wayne, it would tell you that this marriage was solemnized in the Presbyterian Church. And then you could go look for that record if it exists in that particular church. So go back to the original record if you can. For here in Indiana, there was a directory, a WPA listing or inventory of church records that was prepared in 1941. They went denomination by denomination and listed what religious bodies were extant at the time and what records were there. So they would list, for example, by county, and they would have, this is the Methodist section. They listed all the Methodist churches. There's Tippecanoe County's Methodist churches. There's Cass counties. There's St. Joseph counties and so forth. They listed them by town and sometimes by city as well, or county. And you could then get a list of the congregations there. And so that can be helpful for a particular time. Some of these congregations may have closed since then. So it's an example of what existed at that time. There's certainly etiquette for using church records, and I want to touch on that as well, because once you find a church, you should be very respectful of the record custodians. Remember, these are not public records, and we don't have an automatic right to see them like we would a will or a marriage record or something that's in a courthouse. These are private records held by a congregation. So always call ahead and make an appointment to see the records if you can. Some churches will allow you to look at them, some will not. Some will have their secretary look at the records for you and then report back to you. So it can vary, and don't be surprised about that or upset about that if you can't actually see the actual book. Remember that church records, I say, are not public. Be courteous and be prepared also to make a financial contribution. If you're going to a church and looking at the records, be sure to give them $20, $30, something like that, as a thank you for the hassle, because it is a hassle for them sometimes to get these records out. Sometimes they're stored away in safes or in difficult access places. Some of them have a lot of other business to take care of, getting their bulletins ready for Sunday morning and so forth, and doing genealogy stuff is not their usual thing. So be prepared for that. Okay, I want to turn now to the different types of church records that exist and take you on a visual tour of what the records look like. And I want to start with what we call sacramental church registers. Many of the examples I'm going to show you are from our collection here at the Allen County Public Library, but the same principles apply to the records in other states. The Catholics, Lutherans, Reformed, Episcopal, Presbyterian, Orthodox, and sometimes Methodist churches all kept what we call sacramental church registers. They believed in infant baptism. They took careful records of children being baptized. Sometimes they recorded marriages, or usually they did. They recorded confirmations, and they recorded burials. Keeping these records are necessary for maintaining church membership. So they for their very existence, they needed to maintain good records of their people to know whether they were confirmed, whether they were full members of the church, or whether they had just been baptized. It allowed them to navigate sort of the complexity of becoming a member of that church. For the Catholic Church, baptismal records, marriage records, burial, confirmation, and first communion records are the typical types of records you will find. Until modern times, Catholic Church records were written in Latin. Beginning in 1917, Pope Benedict XV required that parish priests keep detailed information on each parishioner, including date of baptism, first communion, and marriage. records are not as complete before this date, but often are more extensive than for other denominations. Sometimes the priest will list the parents of the bride and the groom, the place of birth, especially in marriage records. The names in the earlier records will be usually Latinized, so be aware of that fact and be prepared to convert the names accordingly. So, for example, Charles will be Carolus, John may be Ioannis, Franz or Frank will be Franciscus, Louis may be Ludovicus, James may be Jacobus, Mary will be Maria. So these types of records include baptismal, matrimonial, and burial records, confirmations, and first communions. You will find membership or communion lists, and sometimes what we call parish council minutes. Godparents were always listed, and they're important to make note of because they may lead to further clues. The godparents may be other relatives, or they may be close friends, people from perhaps the same town in Germany where your people were from. So keeping records of those can be important. Baptismal registers usually follow a certain format depending on the style of the priest, and usually can make sense of it once you see the form he was following. So be aware of the forms that were used. We'll show some examples. Here's a sort of a sloppy handwriting, but this is from St. Bridget's Catholic Church in Indianapolis, which was an Irish church. And we see this record, Mary Kavanaugh. You will note the child is called Mariam. So it says the record reads May 5th, baptized Mariam, but her name is probably Mary, born on the 20th of April, daughter of Bartholomew Kavanaugh. Note the different spelling of Kavanaugh, and Delia Cunningham. Sponsors were Bartholomew Gardner and Nora Mulreen. And so sometimes you'll find a child being baptized after the name of one of the godparents. So perhaps you might find some connection there, that the father was Bartholomew and one of the sponsors was Bartholomew. There might be some connection there too. It's hard to say, but be aware of that. Here's a marriage record. This is from a German Catholic church. This is St. John the Baptist Catholic Church in Vincennes. You'll see Karl or Charles Buchmann and Anna Maria Nauher. And this was nice to the priest to put their names of the parties in a special column. We can easily pick it out. On the first day of July, 1851, Charles Buchmann, the son of Gerhard Buchmann and Angela Longus of Osnabrück in Johenken, Kingdom of Hanover, with cum, which means marriage, with Anna Maria Nauher, the daughter of Christopher Nauher and Katharina Maria Wichmann of Walnuss, near Osnabrück in Hanover, age 27, with the witnesses Frederick Buhlmann and Gerhard Rucker. Look at the amount of detail we're given here. We find the places of the origin for both parties and the names of their parents and the witnesses. Some parish priests were not nearly as conscientious in recording this type of information, so don't get too excited that you're going to find this in every case, because it's a bit unusual. But if you are looking for European origins of someone, looking for the church record is one possible place to find it. Here's a burial record. This is a later record from the 1940s from the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception here in Fort Wayne. And this postdates the Pope's 1917 edict about keeping of records. So you can see the level of detail now that priests were keeping. That gives the name of the person, John O'Ryan, age 80, found dead of a heart ailment, an exemplary Christian. He never missed Holy Communion. Gives a little description about him, something that the priest probably would have said as part of his eulogy. Never damaged railroad property and never injured a person in line of his duty, was intensely respectful of the clergy, and so on. So you get an idea of what might have been said as a eulogy, and they wrote that in the burial record. So by the mid-20th century, you're going to find a lot of good information. Let's talk about Lutheran records now. The Lutheran Church was brought to America by German settlers, and like the Catholic Church, it kept excellent records. It flourished in Pennsylvania from the 1700s and was certainly extant throughout the Midwest by the 1830s, when it experienced phenomenal growth with the influx of German immigrants in the 19th century. The earliest records you will find will be written in German. Later, as different synods emerged, some churches continued to keep records in German, while others adopted English. The synod is the organizational unit under which a group of churches is administered. You will need to determine the synod of the church in which your ancestors belonged, especially if the congregation is no longer extant, because each synod maintains a separate archives, both national and regional. Synods vary greatly in doctrine. Some churches in what became the Ohio Synod, which is now part of what we call ELCA, or the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, adopted English language services, while the Missouri Synod Lutheran churches did not until after World War I. Hence, if your ancestors attended a Missouri Synod church, you will need to become familiar with reading some basic German, as well as 19th century German script. As with Catholic registers, you can gain a lot of understanding by the form that the pastor used. They all used basic registers of baptisms, marriages, and confirmations and burials, and they also had minutes of meetings, which were known as voters' assembly records. So here is an example of one. This is from St. Peter's Lutheran Church here in Allen County. It's a Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. We have here Anna Katharina Julia, the legitimate daughter of Johann Michael Heber of Frickenhausen, Oberamt Memmingen, Kingdom of Bavaria, and his wife Sarah, née Braun of Birkmansweiler, Oberamt Weiblingen, Kingdom of Württemberg, born 23rd August 1875 at 11:30 in the evening and baptized on the 7th of September 1875. Sponsors were Valentin Lipp and his wife Anne, both from our parish. So again, we're given a lot of great specific information here about the people's origin in Europe. Many Lutheran registers are not this detailed. I picked this one because I know that the pastors at St. Peter's were particularly particular and fastidious about maintaining a lot of detail about their members. It's highly unusual, but it's neat when we can see it. Let's look at a burial register. This is from St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Huntington, Indiana, which is also a Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. This is one of the most informative registers I've ever seen. Most give only a fraction of this type of information. So you can see that it says when he died, the exact date of the time of his death, where he was born, exactly where he was born. It gives his parents' names, the maiden name of his mother. It gives his confirmation date. It says they were married 18 years, sharing joy and sorrow. It talks about his final illness, and his funeral text which is very important. Often they chose the same funeral text as they did at the time of their confirmation. So that's something to look for. So this is great when you find something as detailed as this. Confirmation registers. This is one from Emmanuel Zoest Lutheran Church in Allen County. Usually children were confirmed when they were around 13 or 14 years old, sometimes a little earlier, sometimes a little later. And sometimes you'll see lists of children's names and the date of the confirmation. Sometimes you'll find actual birth ages, or sometimes even birth dates in there with them. This is a very simple record. It doesn't give a lot of information. Voters' assembly records. These are records of parish business meetings. If you think your ancestor may have been active in the congregation, this is from St. Paul's Lutheran Church here in Fort Wayne, where they listed officers, people who were deacons, people who were elected secretary, the matters that were brought before the congregation for decisions, and a very democratic type process. You don't see this sort of democracy in the Catholic Church. You do sign something called voters' assembly minutes occasionally, but mostly in Protestant denominations do you see detailed minutes like this being kept. The Reformed Church is another congregation that kept sacramental registers. It's now part of the United Church of Christ after its merger with the Congregational Church, and its records are similar to those of Lutheran churches. Members of the Reformed tradition tended to come from Switzerland or Eastern France, as well as Germany, and this denomination also kept baptisms, marriages, burials, confirmations. They also kept family registers, which I'll show you an example of here. This is a baptismal register from St. John's Reformed Church. Now it's called Grace St. John's Church here in Fort Wayne. It gives you the names of the parties and gives you the child and the date, but not much more information than that. Notice we're not given the names of godparents, for example. We're not given the date of birth. We're just given the date of baptism. So it's kind of minimal information that they recorded here. But you'll see this type of record quite common in many places. Here's a marriage record from the same church. And again, it's somewhat more detailed, from the names of parents of the bride and groom, but not the birth dates or places of birth. Though significantly witnesses were included, which can give you clues about other possible family members. And here's an example of a family register. This was a very common German thing to do. You'll see this in German records all the time. The pastor would have a book where he would go through all the baptism records and marriage records and compile like family groups charts of the families, showing all the children when they were born, deaths when they occurred, and so forth. And they registered them in a kind of register where you can look up the name of the family. So this can be kind of a helpful thing if someone took the time to do it. Many churches didn't do it, but we do see it in Reformed churches, and sometimes we see it also in Lutheran churches. It was, as I say, a very German custom. Episcopal Church was another one that kept parish registers. They kept records of baptism, confirmation, marriage, and burial, as well as communicants, sometimes also lists of contributions to the church. Records are always in English. Now, unlike early Lutheran and Catholic records, which were often free form, most Episcopal records were kept in specially designed books. They vary to some extent according to how the rector or the pastor kept the records. Some give detailed information, other less so, but sometimes they included quirky and unusual information, depending on the record-keeping style. Here is Trinity Episcopal Church in Fort Wayne, a very typical baptismal register. I have them for many other denominations or other Episcopal parishes, but you'll see they have a date, the date of the baptism, the name of the child, the names of the parents. Sometimes you'll find a set of parents will come in and baptize all of their children at one time, even older children who had never gotten baptized. So you'll see a record of them all getting baptized at once. Sometimes I have seen records where they will give the birth date of the child. I have seen some that don't. It just depends. Usually they will include the godparents. Usually they're on the opposite page, which I didn't copy here. Here is a marriage record and shows the names of the people getting married, the date of the marriage, and where the place of the marriage took place. So they weren't always at church. Sometimes you'll find one at church, but you'll see one was at Mr. Carson's private parlors, and one was at Mrs. Beecher's house. One was in the rector's parlor. So it's interesting where these marriages did not always take place in church. And then on the other side of the page, it gives the name of the clergyman and it says who the witnesses were. So sometimes it'll give you names of people who were there attending the ceremony, which can be kind of interesting. Burial records, usually they give the date of the death, the name of the deceased, the time of the death, sometimes just the day. Sometimes you'll find records giving more specific information. And then they usually listed the age of the person, where the cemetery was, where they were buried, and the clergyman who was presiding at the time that the burial was made. So again, some good information there. It's nice that they show the cemetery. Mainline Protestant churches, which I'm going to sort of group together, historically are often less concerned with keeping as detailed a record of baptisms, marriages, and burials, although many do so today, and some did so in the past. Sometimes they kept detailed parish registers. They often kept detailed membership lists, and they also kept very detailed minute meetings, sometimes with covenant or a constitution about how the congregation was formed. So, for example, let's look at the Methodists. The Methodists were one of the largest churches on the frontier. It's now called the United Methodist Church, but there were also Free Methodists and Wesleyan Methodists, which are different denominations. It was certainly the largest denomination in Indiana and other Midwestern states. It kept detailed membership lists and meeting minutes, and it did keep membership or parish registers later in the 19th century, but often not in the really early period of the 19th century. So here's an example of the Marian Methodist Episcopal Church. It's a list of members from the 1840s. Someone has typed it up from what was written in there. So you'll just kind of name, you'll find the date that they were admitted to the church, and then some note that they removed, they left, they were discontinued. One person there was expelled. Sometimes if someone died, they'll write the date of death in there. So not a lot of information about the person, just a list of people. That's quite common. Here's another membership list. This is from the Grace Methodist Church in Hartford City, Indiana. This was divided into people who were full members in full standing and people who were provincial or who were probationers, who had declared their interest in joining but were waiting to receive full membership. And when they received full membership, they were confirmed and taken into the church. These typically include the dates of admission and dismissal, and sometimes there will be determinations or notations about whether the person, where the person lived prior to the entering of the church and where they went after they left. And sometimes you'll also find death information here. Here's a list of probationers. This is from the same church. Meeting minutes are very important for this congregation. Methodist Church has kept minutes of meetings where church business was conducted. Sometimes you will find lists of people being admitted as new members. This is from the Marian Methodist Church, 1880, showing people listing the people who were there at the meeting and who were elected to various committees and so forth. Here's the Farmland Methodist Episcopal Church baptism. This is what a baptismal register looks like in a Methodist church. Again, not a lot of information. The name of the person being baptized, sometimes the parents, but not for if the person was an adult. If they were, even if an infant, sometimes the information may be minimal. The place of baptism, the date of baptism, and the minister officiating, but no information that they left the place of birth completely blank and they left the date of birth completely blank, even though there was a form to add that in. So this record keeper was really lax in the type of information being recorded. Here's the Grace Methodist Church marriages. Again, very minimal information here. The date, the bride and the groom and where they're from. That's it. No witnesses, nothing more. No list of parents. They did keep conference journals and denominational journals, which can be helpful. Lots of denominations kept journals where they had reports of membership and things that happened. These can be helpful to find if you're trying to look for them. Sometimes libraries will have them. Sometimes they're kept in denominational archives. Let's look at Baptist churches. In the early days of the Methodist Church, as well as in other denominations, including the Baptists, clergy went on what were called circuit riding. They rode around in the wilderness and stopped at different churches or meeting houses, baptized children, conducted services, then kept their record book with them, took it with them, and went on to a different church and baptized another child there. So you will not necessarily find a record book attached to one single church. You will find it attached to one single missionary minister. And so you'll find, for in this particular record, one person was baptized in Goshen, another one was baptized in Kenton, another was baptized in it was back and forth between Kenton and Goshen, and so forth. So this person was this particular pastor was moving back and forth in the 1890s, and so it can be difficult then to find the record of the baptism if it was a circuit rider. And these can sometimes be, again, found in denominational archives, but can be very difficult to find. The Baptist Church will always have their records begin with a government or a congregational covenant, of which the parish sets up the rules of the church, in which everyone agrees to adhere if they join the church. And the records mainly consist of meeting minutes and detailed memberships, which are often detailed. They did not keep records of marriages, generally speaking, because they relied on the local county to keep the record of the marriages. Similarly, they did not always keep records of burials unless there was something in the minutes about it. A baptism was usually when a child was of age to be what was called a believer's baptism, meaning the person was 12, 13, 14, someone old enough to accept Christ into their life, and they did not accept infant baptism. So sometimes there'll be records of these older children being baptized, and you'll sometimes find a record of it in the minutes of the church. So here's the Door Village Baptist Church in LaPorte County, Indiana. The church heard the examination of Miss Cram, Phoebe Clark, and Catherine Willis, and voted to receive them after the sermon. These with before mentioned were baptized by Elder Nickerson in Clear Lake. So he went to the lake after they were admitted as members, and they were baptized as adults in the record. And then this one wrote a little note in there about it. So interesting to see that's going to be your baptismal record for these people. There's not going to be a formal register listing a baptism like we would have seen in the other denominations. This is First Baptist Church Fort Wayne membership book. This is shows, they kept very detailed minutes of meetings. They're often worth the time it takes to read them. You'll find a glimpse of your ancestors' role in these churches. Sometimes you'll find someone being kicked out because they committed some kind of infraction. They went to and visited a bar. They drank alcohol, which was against the rules. They may have gone to a dance. All kinds of things that may have been proscribed for the membership. You'll find those things in the membership rolls. This is the Lost River Baptist Church in Claysville. This is a minute book showing the mission of people when they were admitted and when they later were excluded, maybe when they left. Someone went back in and wrote that they had left. If they were admitted by letter, it means they were members of the church somewhere else, and someone wrote them a letter saying that they were admitted by their experience because they had previous experience and that they didn't have to be rebaptized. But if someone didn't have a letter showing that they had been a member elsewhere, then they had to go through baptism, and they also had to usually give some kind of testimonial before the elders of the church discussing what their faith was. Here's the Friendship Baptist Church, Davies County. Again, a detailed membership list. You'll find information about when people included. You'll find one where they died February the 19th, 1876. That's the only death record you're going to find, but it will be included in a membership list like this. The Presbyterian Church often kept great records as well. They were some of the best records of any of the what I call mainline Protestant churches, if we exclude the Episcopalians. Membership lists were much more detailed with specific references on how a member was admitted, either by certificate or by examination, as well as the date of dismissal or transfer. The minutes, which were usually called session minutes, often contain extensive information about members, including dismissals and other examinations. Many Presbyterian and Congregational churches also kept good records of baptisms. Sometimes these were contained in the session minutes, and sometimes they were found in a separate register. They did believe in infant baptism, so you will find records of children being baptized. You will also find records of marriages and burials for most churches by the end of the 19th century. This is from the First Presbyterian Church. This is a minute book, and you can find this example from 1849. It includes a record of Asa Naylor, who was charged with absenting himself from the communion and public worship of the church, as well as card playing and drinking intoxicating liquors. Again, this is a very interesting kind of detail that all of us as genealogists kind of hope we would find about ancestors, if we can get some clues about what they were actually like as people. Here's a record of a baptismal register. This is the Bath Presbyterian Church in Franklin County, Indiana. The information is fairly standard for the time, though in this instance, the pastor did not fill in the birth date. There was a record of the baptismal date, but there was no attempt to keep information about the godparents. So that was not as important as it was for the other denominations. Sometimes you will find a pew map, and I've seen this in the Episcopal Church as well as in the Presbyterian Church, where people rented pews rather than paying and pledging to a church. You had a particular pew that was your pew. Your name went on the pew, and it cost a certain amount of money to rent that pew for a year. So in this case, you'll see the people who signed up for a particular pew in the church and what they paid for that pew for that particular year. And that gives you an idea of which pews were more expensive, shows you where the pulpit was up in front, gives you sort of an idea of what the layout of the church looked like, and you might be able to find where your ancestor specifically sat inside the church. Congregational Church, which merged with the Reformed Church to become the United Church of Christ, is descended from the Puritan Church of New England, but they did keep parish registers as well as meeting minutes and detailed lists of members, similar to what the Methodists kept. This is Plymouth Congregational Church here in Fort Wayne, a very detailed membership list showing when they were received, how they were received, and date of removal. So gives you an idea of what types of information they were recording there. This is the Church of the Brethren. This was another church, not to be confused with the United Brethren in Christ. They attracted many settlers of German descent mostly from Pennsylvania and Ohio. The earliest records generally consist of session minutes, and later on you will find detailed membership lists. So this one from Manchester, Church of the Brethren Minute Book, you see the list of people who were making an application to be received into the church. They all made satisfactory acknowledgement. The two brethren were received. Sister Foltz, having never been expelled, it was thought not necessary to receive her in the usual way, but is again a loving member of the church. So you get detailed information about people coming into the church and leaving the church. This is the Wildcat Christian Church in Tippecanoe County, Indiana. The Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ, was also a popular denomination, though the number of membership was significantly less than for the Methodists and Baptists. The records are similar to those of the Baptist Church, with session minutes and detailed membership lists. The United Brethren in Christ was popular in Indiana and was organized into circuits, which were similar to the Methodist Church. Like the Church of the Brethren, it also attracted many persons of German descent. The denomination later split into two factions, the New Lights or liberals and the Old Lights or conservatives. The New Lights later merged with the Methodist Church to form the United Methodist Church, and the records of the two denominations are very similar. You see detailed membership lists, dates of admission, dates of departure or leaving, and just useful information that gives you an idea of what they were keeping. Sometimes occupation and so on. This is the Bern Mennonites. The Mennonites and Amish were also a well-known denomination in northern Indiana and began arriving in as early as 1840. Many families in these denominations kept extensive family records, but their congregations did not necessarily keep records. This is because in Switzerland they were often persecuted, and the part of their tradition was not to keep detailed records because they would be evidence against them in court because the denomination was outlawed. Some began keeping, Mennonites especially, began keeping family registers like this one in Barron in Adams County in the late 1800s. That should show the father and the mother and the children and their dates of birth and dates of death, which can be helpful. I want to just touch on Jewish records. Jewish records were often German in style, and they were often kept in German. This is a book that's been translated from the original German. Jewish traders were in Indiana in the early 18th century, but they did not come in appreciable numbers until later. The first temple in Indiana was Achduth Veshalom here in Fort Wayne, founded in 1848. But they're similar to what we would find in Protestant denominations at the time. Detailed minutes of meetings, people who were being appointed to different committees, lists of people and their contributions. So it was admissions, dismissals, sometimes records of people dying and their dates of death or burial. Those were all recorded, typically in temple records. The Quakers were another early denomination. It's called the Society of Friends, an important historical denomination in Indiana. Many of them drew significant numbers here as well as in Michigan and Iowa. Many of these meetings trace their origin to settlers from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and especially North Carolina, where they kept detailed minutes of both their meetings and their members. Types of records include detailed membership, marriage records. Couples in unity with the meeting had to get their permission to marry from the committee of the church, whose task was to determine if there were any impediments to the marriage. Those who chose a partner but did not go through this procedure were declared having married contrary to discipline. And if they married a non-Quaker, they were declared having married out of unity. So Quaker marriages were performed by the meeting itself and not by an officiating clergyman. So you stand before the congregation and all the people there collectively marry you, and they all sign the marriage book showing that you had been married by them. So it's an interesting process. It's very different from the other types of records. Births were kept as a part of membership. They did not believe in baptism like we consider it, but they did keep very detailed records of births as part of membership records. Some were birthright Quakers, others were what were called convinced friends, which means they were converted to the church. And there'll be deaths were also sometimes recorded. They were supposed to be recorded since Quakers did not always believe in tombstones and generally did not use them in the 19th century. Quakers loved committees and formed committees within their meetings to perform a variety of tasks, which you will find in the minutes. They recorded certificates of removal or dismissal, which were necessary when someone moved from one meeting to another. This is from the Mississinawa monthly meeting in Miami County. This is the Pleasant Plain monthly meeting in Howard County. This is a record of membership. So they would show where they were from, dates of admission, and the names of the parents. And then this place, I think these are birth dates, and they were printed by birthright because they were born into the meeting. Their parents were confirmed members. Some are by request, which means they were not born into the faith, but were admitted later as adults. So this gives you some idea of what kinds of things you're going to find in dealing with church records. I want to close with a couple pieces of advice. First, be creative in your search for records. The successful searcher will cover a lot of ground, visiting genealogical libraries, denominational archives, manuscript collections, and doing field research in individual churches. Second, think broadly about what a church record is. Not necessarily just parish records, but a variety of other documents kept by a church, minutes, bulletins, even newspapers, even photos. Third, look at church records not only for names and dates, but also for other information about your ancestors, and try to put the church into the historical context. Do what you can to research it. If you know your ancestors belong to a particular church, what do you know about its beliefs, its political beliefs, its social justice beliefs? If your ancestor was a Methodist in Indiana before the Civil War, there's a good chance they were abolitionist. And just like the Presbyterians, that may have made them different from Episcopalians or Catholics or Lutherans. So those types of things will help you frame your ancestor, put them into context. And that's the sort of thing we want to do when we look for these types of records. So thank you. I'm available for questions, and let me get out of this. There I go.
Thank you, John.
Okay.
That was great. And the chat was incredibly active, which I enjoy seeing. That means
Good.
that people were having great conversations. But there are also a lot of questions in the Q&A. So, you ready for this?
Okay, I'll have to give it a try.
All right. So somebody is wondering where they can find Lutheran records from Dark and Mercer counties in Ohio and Jay County, Indiana. So specifically, what would you recommend? Where would you tell them to start looking for Lutheran
First
records?
step is to find out what synod, because if it's Missouri Synod, that will be different than if it was the Ohio Synod, and the records will depend on what archives to go to. So you'll need to look at some county histories and see what churches were there in the area where your family lived, and then Google them. See if they have a website now, and see if you can determine if they're ELCA or Missouri Synod or Wisconsin Synod. They all have different denominations and different denominational archives. And so that's the first step, is to figure out which synod they belong to.
Perfect, thank you. So how do you find a church in the 1800s that may have been dissolved or become part of another church? They're specifically looking for an Indiana church.
That can be tough. You really have to, if it was just a mainline Protestant church, it can be difficult. It may have disappeared, but it may have been subsumed into some other church in the area. So talk to the historical society in the area, see if someone knows about it. Look at the county histories. Maybe something in newspapers. You want to go to newspapers.com or newspaper archives, see if there's something there. If you know a denomination, if it may have merged with some other church in the same denomination. So you want to check that. I've had that situation in the Detroit area. I have German Lutheran ancestors in the Detroit area, and congregations that they belong to have folded because Detroit has changed so much, and they moved to the suburbs, and then they folded into other churches. So I had to write to denominational archives, and finally I was able to get some direction, but it was hard to do. So that can help. If you know the ethnicity of the family, if they were German speaking, they were probably going to be Catholic or Lutheran or Reformed. So that will help narrow it a little bit. So
Awesome. So you mentioned newspapers. If you guys live in the state of Indiana, there's a website called Inspire. I just put it in the chat, and you can access some newspapers.com titles for free from home. So that's in the chat right now, but only if you live in the state of Indiana. Okay, so let's see here. Would you explain the term probationers more? Were there some
probationers?
Yeah.
Sure. Let's say someone wanted to become a Methodist, and they go to the church there, and they said, I want to become a member of your church. They didn't just say, sure, we'll welcome you your first day, you're a member now. You had to go through a learning process where you were on probation, essentially, as a prospective member, but you were not formally admitted into the church as a full member. They wanted to, the people at the church wanted to observe you, wanted to make sure you're a good person, wanted to make sure you were going to follow all the rules of the church, and then you were committed to the church, and so you were going to attend for a while, and then you would be formally admitted into the church itself, usually by a bishop, and that you would be confirmed and then made a full member at that point. So that it was a process of that you'd go through, kind of a probation process, essentially.
Awesome, thank you. Did the German clergy have a circuit too?
Sometimes, I mean, I think the brethren did. I think it depended on how many church missionaries were available at a time. Some of the really early Lutheran ministers here in Allen County moved around, because there weren't very many of them right at the very beginning, and they went around to different churches. But the books usually stayed with the church; they didn't stay with the minister. I've seen Catholic priests among the French Catholics here in Allen County moving from St. Vincent de Paul and St. Louis Besançon here in Allen County, where they were both heavily French areas. And so you'll find records there, but they were kept with the church. They weren't like their circuit writing book that I showed that were where the person carried it around, but there were German Presbyterians and German Methodists. German Methodists were we call, think of Dunkers. They were another group of people, and those people did ride circuits, and the records can be really hard to find because the minister did take them with him. So
thank you. Okay. Again, when a church closes, what happens to the records?
Good question. It depends on, again, what it's affiliated with. If it's affiliated with a larger entity like a diocese, then the records would go to the diocese. For example, I'm an Episcopalian, so I belong to the Diocese of Northern Indiana. So when a church closes, and we've had a number that closed, I, as the archivist, get those records. The church closes, the records are given to me, and then the rest of the things are sold. And so we keep them on the denominational level. So for other denominations, there are similar types of things. The Catholic Church has an archives for its usually at the diocesan level. There are Methodist archives. There are a variety of denominational archives out there. The Missouri Synod Lutherans have their main archives in St. Louis. That's called Concordia Seminary. So there may be in a seminary library. There may be some entity that where those records are sent. And that's what you need to find out, is what entity did it belong, and they aren't usually thrown away. That's an asterisk. They aren't usually thrown away, but I've read a story just recently of someone who's in New York City walking down the sidewalk and found all these original records from the 1840s, 50s, and 60s stacked by the curb, ready to be thrown out. And this person walking said, "Oh my gosh," picked them up and found out that it was from a church and they were just being thrown away. They were eventually rescued and sent to a library that wanted them. So sometimes they do get thrown out, but mostly we hope they have the good sense not to throw them out.
Thank you. It looks like they followed up and said that it was a more recent closing, like 1990s, 1980s.
So what denomination is it?
It's a Baptist.
Baptist, and there must be a Baptist college or a place where it could be that they're sent to. Look under Baptist archives in the area where in the state where you're researching, and see where they are. There are different Baptist archives around.
Thank you. So this person's ancestor was a Presbyterian minister in Indiana in the mid 1800s, and they're looking to figure out if there's any records to show where he received training. They know where a couple of the churches are where he served, but they couldn't find mention at the church listing him as a minister. So they're wondering if he was really an elder rather than a minister.
Presbyterian, I would start out with the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. They're sort of a national archives of Presbyterian records that they're kept nationally, and a lot of churches are encouraged to send records there. There may be, Presbyterian ministers were usually highly educated, so they usually had formal seminary training. So you'll want to look for some kind of book that maybe lists graduates of various seminaries from the time period. There may be some kind of necrologies that were kept when a minister died that would give information about that. So I would contact them if it's a Presbyterian minister.
Perfect. Thank you. Someone's asking, how can we figure out which brethren group our ancestor was a part of? Meaning, which of the two similar sounding brethren groups they were?
I don't know. There's the Church of the Brethren and there's the United Brethren in Christ. The United Brethren in Christ archives, I think, is at Huntington College. And the Church of the Brethren, I've forgotten where their archives is offhand, but they do have an archives. So you need to figure out which one it was, because both of them attracted Germans. So it was probably going to be Church of the Brethren, my guess, but I can't be sure. I think Church of the Brethren was a little bit larger and they were spread out more. But you might contact the archives for those denominations.
Thank you. Somebody's wondering about churches that share the same building. How would you navigate those records?
Well, they still kept their own records. I mean, that was commonplace in time in the especially in the early 1800s, because there was only maybe one meeting hall or a courthouse or someplace where people met, and one congregation would meet in the morning and the other in the afternoon, and they shared the building, but that has nothing to do with the records. They each would have kept their own membership and meeting records. So you need to track the congregation and not necessarily deal with the building, because they wouldn't have merged their records. They would have kept separate books.
Thank you. There's about 3 questions left, so we're just going to answer those and call it a day. If a parishioner moved to the area, is it common to record what area or similar church they joined?
Well, they would have joined the church. There would be a record of members, and it would list that person being admitted into the church. And sometimes on that list, it might say where they came from. A Quaker certainly would have said where they were coming from. Some lists, as you saw in my examples, were very minimal, didn't keep very much information. They just said admitted by letter and didn't necessarily say where they came from. But there should be a record of their admission and their record of their dismissal from one place to another. But the two churches may not have kept detailed records of which of the two in one place.
Thank you. Do you know about Black female ministers? Are there any bulletins or records on these? This was a minister in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Really interesting question. I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. The African American Episcopal Church, AME Church, was the largest denomination for African Americans at that time, and they certainly kept meeting minutes. The ones for here in Fort Wayne are lost in the early period of time. So, but there are archives around that keep those records. I think there's one in Virginia that keeps them nationally for churches all over the country. I'd have to look for it, but if you do AME Church archives, Virginia, I think you'll find it. That might be a place to look. They would have had to be ordained, and there would be a record of it at some point. So it's unusual to see female clergy that early for most denominations. You don't really see, you saw some denominations have female clergy in the 20th century, but it was unusual until later, until like the 1960s. You see a lot of other Protestant denominations having them. But there certainly could have been. And there may have been women who were deacons, not necessarily full-fledged ordained ministers, but were deacons, and that gave them ministerial rights to lead congregations and so forth. So they may have been elected that way. So that there's other possibilities there. Try to find the records from the church if they exist.
Perfect, thank you. All right, and then this is the last question. It's a follow-up to a previous one, but the basic gist is trying to find information on the Lutheran records when they switched from the Ohio Synod to the Missouri Synod.
Oh, it switched. That's really unusual. Well, Concordia Institute would be the place to start to find out when the document when that change happened. They have excellent records. I've used them before, and they can tell you, if you give them the name of the church, what happened to it. There was some sort of denominational conflict in that congregation if it was led into it, because the Ohio Synod had different views about things than the Missouri Synod people did. They often conducted services in English, but sometimes not always. Sometimes they kept them in German too, but there must have been something that led them to leave the one to the other. And it would be more likely to be found in the denomination that it moved to. So I would start with Concordia Institute in St. Louis.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so that's it for the questions today. Thank you everyone for asking amazing questions and having a great conversation in the chat. Thank you, John, for a wonderful program, per usual. People have been very happy in the chat, so thank you everybody for joining us today, and hopefully we see you on Thursday, and have a wonderful day. Bye.
Happy holidays.